Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome. Happy Friday. Hey, Friday. I hope I sound well, like you can hear me really well because I changed. You might notice that the color is a little sharper. I changed my webcam this week, and I am really excited because I feel like this is a better representation of what's really going on around here, and it has a built-in microphone, so hopefully the sound is also really good. I have an external microphone, so if I need to change, I can, but I'm excited to use this. So today we have actually something a little bit long, but I hope that we're going to be able to get through it because it should be faster. We're going out of order. You know, I have a whole list of all the papers I want to run through. And the last paper we did, which was Poetry, Vegetality, Relief from Being. If you have not watched that two-parter, go watch it. It's really, really good. I still have to publish it on my website. I haven't done that yet, but it is really good. It's here in the Naturally Conscious community. It's just something that introduced a whole series of concepts. So here we're going to take a turn in another direction, and we're moving towards a paper, kind of a report. It's not a paper, it's more of a report that just came out by Paul Moss at the University of Virginia, I want to say where he is, but I guess when we get into it, we'll find out. And Paul Moss is the current volunteer director of the Plant Initiative. If you don't know the Plant Initiative is a group that started up, I think, either last year or the year before, and they are really a plant advocacy group. They're a group that brings together lots of different disciplines in academia and in the arts, and are moving towards this idea of what does real plant and human plant relations, what could they look like? They advocate for the more than human worlds, but mostly they're really about plant advocacy. And I'm excited that he put out this report. And I wanted to go through it because I think that here in NCC, we have such great conversations, and we're having such a variety where when I go into a lot of these different groups and I try to have certain conversations, and they're great conversations, by the way, but they're very kind of either academically slanted or research slanted. There is a fair amount now of artistically slanted, which is great. And what I love about NCC is that we have this almost any person kind of thing, in the sense that I love that all of us are coming from different wakes of life, not necessarily all professionally based. And so we're having all these experiences and our conversations and our research and our books and our art and everything, but it is with the goal of the personal development that comes from that and the relationships we're building with individual plants or with plants, the whole plant kin home as a full. And I love that we're doing that here. And where I find that in other groups, it's very tied to still climate models or like I said, academia and such like that. So I'm hoping that this report in some ways helps us bridge what they're doing and what we're doing, which I don't think is very different. I just think it's kind of like the way we're looking at it, but also expands us here in the Naturally Conscious community. I think as Sprouts, we're always looking to enhance our relationship with plants, to be as expansive as possible. And I'm hoping that some of the advocacy conversations that Paul has the privilege, because of his position, to be able to kind of be in the thick of, might help us better see how we ourselves, through our individual and our personal relationships with plants, are doing this sort of advocacy work. So I think in some ways, this is my guess, okay? We won't know until we get into it. I think in some ways, this is going to help us give ourselves a pat on the back, not from the perspective of like, you're so awesome. I mean, we are awesome, by the way. You as Sprouts are all awesome, but really from the perspective of like, wow, we really are doing a lot. And also help us kind of bridge from, sometimes when we're having our individual relationships with plants, it's easy to not see the impact on the greater world. And what I'm thinking is going to happen, or at least that's what I'm hoping is going to happen, is that as we enter into some of these plant advocacy movements, we're going to see that we actually are doing amazing plant advocacy as Sprouts. And that all we need to do is kind of shift and realize that our one-on-one relationships are our, relationships with the ecosystems in which we live are actually really making a huge impact, because I feel like there's a reciprocal exchange from the people that are working on big systems models and those of us that are working on smaller system models. Hopefully that made sense. But, that's what I'm really kind of looking forward to in this. So let me share my screen and let's just, dive into it, because, how this is. It just takes time to do this right. And so here we go. Actually, let me see what happens. Can I, but will it let me make it bigger? No, that's too small. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to do it this way because I like the idea that we can make the text much bigger. Okay, so as I said before, this is toward a plant advocacy movement. So the plant initiative in some ways is really pushing the movement. And I have to say that when I first started the Naturally Conscious community, there was a part of me that, and I still think this, I really do think that we in NCC are a movement. The movement towards naturally conscious living is, for me, a movement more than anything. And I feel my personal mission, and I am totally open, I love to hear what your thoughts are. So please feel free to, if you're watching live, put it into the chat. If instead you're watching the replay, which we always love you, and we love all of you, I love all of you, to please put it into a comment, is, do you see NCC, do you see naturally conscious living as a movement? And I purposely didn't call it plant specific, because I was going towards the idea of what happens when we step deeper into the fact that we are nature. This is a big sticking and a big point that I make, is that for us, we have to embrace our plantness. And like we talked about in the paper last week, that helped enhance this vegetality. What does it look like to embrace your plantness more? Which I feel is going to influence the way I think about I Am Plant the next time we do it, which is in early 2024. But also the idea that we're reading in our book club on the Underland, and we're starting to get into deep time and to geology. And also when we read Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, and we got into the whole idea of fungi. It's really about stepping deeper into our natural intelligence, into our natural way of being, of flowing more consciously between my plantness and my humanness and my instinctual animalness and my rockness and all of these different things. And I think we're going to find ourselves really flowing through these much more as we go forward, even though my central conduit to get into that is through the plants. And I feel like all of you, obviously you're here, have that same feeling. And so I do think of us as a movement, but I feel like our movement is really a movement of personal expansion that then leads to impact into the world. And I feel like, of course, the Plan Initiative, being that it's born from an academic base, really does look at this more from the perspective of really thinking about this more as a movement. Excuse me for a second while I get rid of, all right, that's not working. Appearance. I want to go here. You're going to see what I'm doing. All right. So this is going more from an academic movement, sort of from the big system scales, and then going down. So they're just two different approaches, and I think each one has their power. But that's always been my approach, is to encourage you. And this is why I also do it through the coaching and through the mentorship that I do one-on-one, as well as in the group work, is because the more naturally conscious you are, then the more your actions, whatever they are, even if it's just the way that you tend to your family or your land or the house plants, or your your shopping experiences, are born naturally conscious, and therefore they're going to make an impact in the world. And that's just one, it's just one way of looking at it. This is the other way. So like I said, this is from Paul Moss, Executive Director of the Plant Initiative. And so let's get into it. Report overview. There is not currently, and I think I can make this even a little bit bigger. There we go. There is not currently an identifiable movement that advocates on behalf of plants. We do. We here, World Ambassador for Plant Intelligence. Maybe just World Ambassador for Plants. Maybe I should change my title. What do you think? Should I change my title so that it's World Ambassador for Plant Intelligence or World Ambassador for Plants? Does it matter? I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Serious consideration of ethical treatment of plants, plant rights, and plant personhood remains on the margins of academic thought and popular understanding. However, there are many disconnected components of what could potentially constitute such a movement. This report presents reason why such a movement is timely, outlines challenges that such a movement would face, considers what can be learned from the animal advocacy movement, and suggests potential approaches that could be useful for operationalizing a plant advocacy movement. So, introduction. Plants are, for the most part, treated in the dominant culture merely as passive resources available for human use. Truth. Truth. Plant lives are typically not considered to possess intrinsic value. Consideration of ethical treatment of plants, plant rights, and plant personhood remains on the margins of popular awareness and acceptance. What is missing in order to change the ways in which dominant culture relates to plants is an operational framework that encourages the incorporation of ethically based ways of understanding, using, and being with plants. A plant advocacy movement. Such a movement would be based upon respect for plant lives and would recognize their intrinsic value. Social movements are important and effective vehicles for creating change in societal attitudes and behaviors. This report presents the rationale, direction, and opportunity for plant advocacy movement whose time has arguably arrived. I want to take a quick aside to say that while I agree with everything that Paul writes in this particular piece, I think that there's another aspect of this that if we're going to do a true plant advocacy movement, we need to have that's very different from the animal rights movement. This is based on what we are doing in NCC and the experience that I have working with all of you and how much I respect the conversations that we have, is that when it comes to plant advocacy, different than animal, we need to address also not just plants and plant personhood. We need to address the fundamental shift to human society when we have a relationship with plants that's different. Because even when I've gone into plant initiative events and I've had conversations with people, there is still a very deep lack of conversation around the fact that when I recognize the inherent plantness, consciousness, awareness, liveness, personhood, whatever words we want to use around this, things like my clothing choices shift, or at least they do in the beginning. We don't even know what they look like. We've had this conversation multiple times where we're still, even us here in NCC are at our infancy of this conversation of like paper use versus wood. Is it better to be plastic? The whole conversation that Return of the Yggdrasil brought up, for those of you that are in the Plant Wisdom Book Club, Return of the Yggdrasil was a great book to help open and expand to us the idea of, should we even be eating plants? And what does that mean? And I know you know my thoughts on this, so I'm not going to get into it, but like that conversation, and I have a feeling, is missing from this document. And without that fundamental that the movement has to address the fear factor. It has to create space for conversations that today we do not have answers to. And I think that this is what NCC does so well. So if you're asking, like, if people are asking you, why should I join NCC? That's one of the reasons. The fact that we can have a conversation about that inherent fear factor that we don't yet know how to solve, but we're willing to go into it. We're willing to have a conversation. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat or the comments as to whether you think that this is a big part of what we do and of why we are there to have these conversations. Carol, I like that. And I'm an ambassador for plant advocacy. This is a good title too. Ooh. Veronica, take note of that. We're going to talk about it. Ambassador for plant advocacy. I like this. I like this a lot. Okay. So yeah, that concept of addressing the fear factor and of being very honest to say, in some of these cases, We don't actually know the right answer. And I think that this is going to shift the animal advocacy market as well, like market movement, excuse me. The animal advocacy movement has to switch too, because the conversation is not as black and white as like, thou shalt not kill. It's not even that black and white in the humans, but we're not going to get into that. But because when you look at it from a spiritual perspective, there's a lot more that goes into it. But especially in the plant world, thou shalt not kill is pretty much impossible. Impossible. So, trends supporting a plant advocacy movement. A number of trends are encouraging the development of a plant advocacy movement, with the following being in particular importance. Scientific findings about plants percolating into public consciousness. Despite nearly century-old research on nerve-like functions in plants, as well as, oh, I have a Bose paper that I want to go through with you. I have to add it into it. As well as earlier work by Darwin and Darwin on plant movement, it wasn't until recent decades that a critical mass of scientific research has emerged describing the complex nature of plants as intelligent biological beings. Numerous studies now recognize plants' highly developed capabilities, including forms of sentience, communication, learning, and memory. Very careful not to add the word consciousness yet. We're not there yet. The functional similarities between plants and animals are remarkable, and scientific findings raise questions about the rigidly perceived separation between plants and animals, particularly in light of their common ancestry and genetic similarities. A growing number of scientists are communicating to the broader scientific community and the public about advanced capacities and agency, and he lists all of them. Non-scientists have also written for the public on this topic. Tompkins and Bird, The Secret Lives of Plants, Pollan, Michael Pollan, which we've, read about. We actually haven't read one of his books yet, but I know Veronica's still voting on it, and I have a feeling we're going to eventually get there. Veronica, I see your vote. I know we're going to get there. Growing focus on plants and philosophy and environmental ethics. Philosophical speculation about the nature of plants has been recorded as early as classical Greece in the writings of Aristotle, Plato, Theophrastus, and consideration of plants' rights, even though satirical, occupies a chapter in Samuel Butler's Erewhon from 1972, 1968, somewhere. In the past 2 decades, scholars in the humanities and philosophers in particular have been increasingly considering ethical issues related to plants. Some notable examples are Matthew Hall's Foundational Plants as Persons, which we haven't reviewed Plants as Persons completely, but we have read. Actually, that's not true. We have read that paper. There are some books, though, that we haven't gone into because they're really thick and they cost a fortune, but there are some really good things. And so, which argues for a deeper and more respectful human relationship with plants based on a range of philosophical, historical, and cultural perspectives. Thomas Puleo, we've also done this paper, also makes a case for extending, wow, we've gone through a lot of these, for extending personhood to plants. Michael Marder's influential plant thinking calls for a greater integration of plants into philosophical thought and recalibrating their position in the world. Chauncey Mayer argues for considering that plants have minds, raising ethical issues about how to relate to plants. Plant ethics presents a broad range of ethical thought relating to plants. Wow, we've gone through a lot of these papers, and I'm proud of us. I'm very proud of us. Broader acceptance of animal rights and rights of nature movement. The animal liberation and rights movements have attracted large numbers of people to their causes. This suggests that there is also an opportunity for a movement with a plant-oriented focus. A plant advocacy movement can be considered to resonate with the animal liberation and rights movement in its effort to advance the status of a certain group of non-human beings. Advocating for plants is also consistent with a total liberation approach, which challenges all lines and boundaries across which vulnerable groups can be oppressed. The animal liberation movement introduced the concept of speciesism as popularized by Singer, which presents species as a socially constructed category. Liberation is seen by some animal advocate scholars as a needed response to this oppression. And I think that there is going to be a lot that we are going to be able to take from the whole animal rights movement, just because animal rights, obviously, as we've talked about when we did some of our legal papers here, does have a considerable amount of years above the plant advocacy. But I do think that there are some pitfalls that we have to keep into consideration, because the animal rights movement in many of its aspects is sort of getting to the idea of non-killing, and there's just some things that we have to, just the same as the idea of speciesism is, you know, constructed socially, we also need to recognize that each type of being, we need to have more clear collaborative discussions. And when I say collaborative, I mean by bringing the species themselves into the conversation in order to be able to really discover, and it's going to be constantly changing as more scientific research comes up, as we become more evolved. I think that the definitions of what is acceptable, what's ethical, what are the values, all these pieces is going to always be somewhat in flux. So I think that what we need to do for a lot of these movements is not just like think we're going to come up with rules, but more like we're going to come up with a constantly shifting set of relational guidelines. I don't know if that explains it correctly, what's in my mind, but it makes some sense in there. On a parallel track to animal advocacy, the growing rights of nature movement uses a legal rights-based approach for protecting non-human interests. It has always been inclusive of plants, and it has always been inclusive of plants. Yes. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. Yes, and as early as the first edition in 1974 of Christopher Stone's Should Trees Have Standing, that's a good one. I haven't read that in a while. Plants have been considered worthy of legal protection. The evolution and structure of the rights of nature movement has been recently studied and summarized by Kaufman and Martin. Some national, local, and tribal governments have taken steps to respect the rights of plants through constitutions, laws, or ordinances. One example is the recognition by the White Earth Band of the Ojibwa, I think that's how you pronounce it, and in the 1855 Treaty Authority of the rights of Manoomin wild rice, and they're bringing a lawsuit against the state of Minnesota on the plant's behalf with Manoomin as the lead plaintiff. This is something we, I think, haven't gotten into because I don't feel extremely super well versed on the broad reach of the rights of nature. We've touched on it from the perspective of some papers that we've gone through, but maybe in the future I'll add it in as a plant-inspired masterclass for 2024, where we kind of dive into it more as a conversation piece to explore whether or not the current rights of nature movement adequately represents plants, or is it still kind of human interest in the human interest of those plants that are being represented. I think that there's still a bit of a clash there, or more than say, I think we're still far behind, but we have the opportunity, I think, to move forward. So it's a good step. Let me just say it that way. But I do think that when it comes to talking about plants, different to waterways and mountains and some other of the beings that have been protected and the persons that have been protected through these rights, I think the plants is still coming at it from a different approach that is not about true collaboration with the plants, but more of the human interest for that plant. And it's still good. Don't get me wrong. It's still good. Yeah, the whole wild rice one, I have to find it. You can probably find it online. I've read through the treaty, and then I've read through the lawsuit. I've read through the lawsuit very briefly, but the lawsuit's interesting, Carol. I think if you're interested in that lawsuit, definitely worth reading up on it. Greater openness to Indigenous and all other alternative ways of thinking. Indigenous perspectives about plants are increasingly being taken seriously and accorded respect in the dominant culture. Woo-hoo! Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, yes, a favorite of the Plant Wisdoms Book Club, is a widely read Indigenous description of the human relationship with plants. Other Indigenous scholars have discussed the human connection with plants, including Wendy McCoon's Ginews, and let's just call him Kiwe, because I think if I try to say the whole thing, I'm going to screw it up. Pichelle, Vine Deloria's writings, such as Spirit and Reasoning, have helped to introduce the broader public to Indigenous thoughts about the connection with other beings, including plants. Gregory Cajete's Native Science presents Indigenous approaches to understanding the world. Indigenous perspectives has also been relayed to the public by other scholars. Graham Harvey's animism has helped to revitalize and to increase respect for the animistic worldview, increased attention to intuitive interspecies communication with plants. Abbott's another interesting one. We haven't gotten there yet because we haven't gotten to 2021, but it's on the list. And many of those other authors too. Also has led to a greater appreciation of the human ability in both indigenous and non-indigenous cultures to use intuitive communication to make personal connection with plants, potentially increasing people's sense of empathy and support for plants. We are big advocates of interspecies communication, big advocate of multi-species communication, all kinds of species communication here. I mean, reconnect with the plant kingdom has existed as a course now for several years, and it's very much geared toward this. And you know, we've done workshops, we've had conversations, we bring all of that into what we do every day. And thank you, Sprouts, for your continued experimentation and expansion in the world of plant communication. I love it. And it is true that there is now more interspecies and multi-species conferences on like that kind of communication. And I think that this is another area that's extremely important. And I'm so happy that it's making it into more academic circles. Urgency of coping with the Anthropocene and the biodiversity crisis. It is foundational in biological science that plants play a critically important role in maintaining Earth's ecosystems. Because of plants' crucial role in maintaining planetary well-being, threats in plant biodiversity, forests, and habitats in the face of mounting human demands are leading to a rising concern about plant survival. In parallel, as the destructive impact of the Anthropocene epoch continues to unfold, many people within the dominant culture are looking to the natural world and to plants in particular for solutions, whether through carbon sequestration, through reforestation, healthier food sources, psychotropic or medicinal purposes, alternatives to fossil fuels, or for a sense of positive connection and support to help cope with an increasingly stressful time. This growing awareness and the importance of plants, and the importance of plants, comma, I know it's not a comma, but places plants and potentially other interests in a more positive light with an increasing number of people. Okay, this part here is the part that I'm always a little weary of. Important, yes, but still very human-centric. And I'd be curious, and maybe this is an activity that we can do in the writing group. Note to self. What if we were to take this paragraph in the writing group and use that as a prompt to rewrite this paragraph from the perspective of a plant? Like, what would that look like? Because I feel like it's going to be different. I feel like we're not taking the plant's perspective on this. We're taking a perspective of humans that are afraid that we're going to ruin the world and we're not going to be able to survive. Note to self. So we might add this. Lori, if you listen to this, this is a prompt. Increased recognition of biophilia as contributor to human health and well-being. Biophilia can be understood as a desire to connect with other forms of life, which is innate in humans. Connection with nature, including plants, has been increasingly recognized as contributing to human health and well-being. This understanding predisposes people towards positive attitudes towards plants and potentially a willingness to advocate for them. And I think that this is a factor that we can use to kind of like bridge between very mainstream cultures that maybe don't have any awareness and the beginning of awareness, but we have to go further from there. But I do think that this is a really great step. Challenges facing the plant advocacy movement. Despite the supportive factors described above, the development of a plant advocacy movement faces significant obstacles, including the following. Let's find out what those are. Lack of agreement on definitions and approach. Makes sense. The movement's goals and definitions have not yet been set forward in a coordinated way, and there is no consensus among those who might become part of the movement about needed next steps. Many unexplored and unanswered questions exist that this movement will need to grapple with as it evolves. For example, are plants to be advocated for because they are sentient or conscious, or because they are living beings, all of whom deserve respect? Is it more important to set aside plants so that they are protected from human use, or to adopt ways of using plants so that both Using plants so that both plants and human goals can be met. What does it mean to respect plants? Is it more effective goal to work toward plant liberation, elevating the intrinsic status and standing of plants in their connection with humans, to try to increase plant welfare using plants in more humane ways, or a mix of both? Should plants be seen as possessing specific rights? Can plants be understood to be able to directly communicate their own needs to humans, or are we not able to know what plants want or prefer? These and other complex strategic questions will need to be considered or debated. I agree with all of these questions. I think these are excellent questions that he's putting forward. I would add the fact of what changes in human society when we recognize plants as fully conscious beings. I feel like this is an extremely important question. What has to change in human society when we do this? And how do we get to that change? Disconnected components of the movement is another challenge. Although a plant advocacy movement does not exist as a coherent entity at this point, there are many unlinked components that could potentially constitute such a movement. These include a wide variety of organizations and entities that are in some fashion working on behalf of plants. Although their work is not necessarily based upon the sense of respect for plants' intrinsic value, some examples are provided below. Although most of the organizations listed in this section are based in the United States, these categories apply internationally. Organizations active in these areas could potentially collaborate and join forces on a large-scale campaign on behalf of plants, such as has occurred with the Endangered Species Coalition, consisting of hundreds of member groups. However, the vast majority of organizations which in some way benefit plants don't currently consider themselves as being a part of a broader plant advocacy movement, and they have not to date sought to collaborate for this purpose. And I can see that they're probably looking at more climate, and we'll find out, I guess, but I have a feeling they're looking at that. Organizations protecting trees and forests. A robust movement exists that works on behalf of trees. This includes organizations focusing on protecting large ancient trees, such as Save the Redwoods League and Sempervirens Fund, as well as other organizations that act on behalf of ancient trees, like Archangel Ancient Tree Archive. That's a good one. What plants are saying that really need to be heard. Yes, Jill, what plants are saying that really need to be heard. That's what we need. We need that. We need to know. That's one of the challenges that we have. What are the plants trying to tell us that we really need to hear? Organizations such as Dogwood Alliance, Old Growth Forest Networks, and Wilderness Committee advocate on behalf of trees in a broader sense and are not focused only on larger charismatic trees. There are also many organizations that, as part of their general effort to protect the environment, aim to protect and preserve forests, such as Earth Justice, Greenpeace, Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, and Stand.Earth. Yet, the other organizations focusing on advocating for urban trees, including American Forest, Arbor Day Foundation, Tree People, and Trees Forever. Additional organizations work for tree planting on a larger scale basis, such as the Greenbelt Movement, International Tree Foundation, Trees for the Future, Tree Sisters, and Tree, Water, and People. Lots of trees, 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 trees. Organizations protecting native plants and rare or endangered plant species. Many groups help to protect plant biodiversity. These include Center for Biological Diversity, Center for Plant Conservation, Flora and Fauna International, Institute for Applied Ecology, the Nature Conservancy, Plant Life, Rewild, and Wild Earth Guardians. There are also many organizations working to increase appreciation for native plants, such as Wild Ones and a large number of local native plant societies. Additional organizations work to preserve certain categories of plants, such as Native Seeds Search, Seed Savers Exchange, and United Plant Savers. There's also indigenous peoples and groups. I think I'm going to stop reading these just for an interest of time, because I think I'll put this obviously in the notes, but I think you can read on the names of the organizations. I thought that they were going to talk about them, but these are really talking just about the list. And I mean, there's so many of them. So then this one I am going to read just because I'm curious as to where vegetarianism and veganism fit into this. These groups seek to improve treatment of animals and or to reduce or eliminate human consumption of animal products. Food derived from animals is often produced at great expense of plant lives, as well as a habitat available for wild plants. For these reasons, groups promoting vegetarianism and veganism indirectly reduce consumption of plants, even though this is not usually stated goal for the organizations. Plant-centered diets avoid the inefficient process of feeding plants to animals for later human consumption of meat and other animal-based foods. Some of these organizations, I feel like this part, we need to send Paul Moss Return of the Yggdrasil. Because I think this still needs some massaging and conversation. Organizations advancing archaeological approaches. I'm sorry, not archaeological, agroecological, excuse me. This is all about kind of, although it's not a typically stated goal of the group to promoting alternative agriculture is the plants themselves, the lives of the plants, but it still could be helpful. Organizations that purchase land to protect it from development and exploitation, although these organizations, again, do not have plant protection as their primary goal, their impact and their work really can serve for this. Organizations working for the rights of nature. Plants fall clearly within the scope of the growing rights of nature group. Leading organizations working in this area include Australian, all this level. And then these groups advocate for respecting the rights of plants, either as an important component of landscapes. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I know infancy, baby steps, and ecological communities, or sometimes on plants' own behalf. So yeah, okay. Organizations working to build spiritual connection with trees and plants. Some organizations incorporate a spiritual connection in their work on behalf of nature and plants. These include Association of Nature, the Forest Therapy Guides and Programs, Friends of Trees, and Organization of Nature Revolutionaries. Well, that's a good thing that he included this. There are organizations that work on behalf of the plant pollinators. By the way, as a small aside, when I was younger and actually thought I might have children at some point, then I made the conscious decision not to, I thought my firstborn would be named Xerxes. So I love that there's the Xerxes Society because that was the name I wanted. I love that name. Okay. Hey, he doesn't mention us. I feel like we should have been called out to plant blindness and ecophobia. It is problematic for a plant advocacy movement that plants are typically viewed in the dominant culture as low status beings designated by custom and biology to be exploited by humans. These are symptoms of plant blindness, which contributes to plants' invisibility and perceived inferiority. Plant blindness, as described by Wandersee and Schussler, and later renamed plant awareness disparity. Still don't like that name, plant awareness. I get why they named it that from a scientific or academic culture, but yeah, okay. One day we'll read that paper together too, because it's interesting. I read it many years ago. Is a phenomenon in which plants are generally considered to be of secondary importance to animals and low maintenance and low importance and interest overall. This mindset presents an impediment to plant advocacy being taken seriously, as the broad subject of plants and their interests is generally considered to be unimportant. Ecophobia operates more broadly than plant blindness and represents a fear or phobia of the entire natural world. This has become increasingly widespread as people become disconnected from nature through spending more time indoors and interacting with the world through technology. Our fairy tales don't help either, by the way. Ecophobia is enhanced by many fairy tales that talk about nature as in like the scary woods or where the witches live that eat your children, in fact. So that's a whole other area that needs to change. Plant advocacy needs to recognize and address both of these phenomena. Inherent conflicts of interest regarding use of plants. The fact that humans need to kill plants either directly or indirectly to be able to live makes it more challenging for people to argue on behalf of plants. Yes, this is that point that I keep making. Since it's not possible to advocate for complete protection of plants in the same way that one can advocate for animals. But can they really for animals? Can they? Can they? We need to rethink that too. The dependence on our economies and societies, because How many animals in nature are carnivorous? And how many are herbivores? We need a broader conversation about respect and awareness. And anyway, I'm not going to go there. I said I wasn't going to go there. Okay. The dependence on our economies and societies on plant products also introduces serious conflicts of interest into the human connection with plants, further reducing the incentive for people to perceive plants through an ethical lens. True. In incipient opponents of the movement, some individuals actively oppose or mock the idea of a plant advocacy movement, even though it arguably does not yet exist. These include strong defenders of anthropocentrism, as well as those perceiving plant advocacy as a threat to animal advocacy. Really? How can that be a threat? I had to read more of that. That part I don't know. In addition, those who dismiss animal rights or environmentalist goals, typically for political, economic, or religious reasons, can also be expected to attempt to stifle efforts for plant advocacy, which they might find contrary to their interests. This is a good point that he calls out. I think this is something important for us to keep in mind. That's just the same as we have, all kinds of different political issues, political conflict of interest. We will have that also in the plant rights movement. Hadn't thought about that. And I think that's one that we don't address very well yet, but maybe it's because it's not important to ours, because we're going through individual movement that bypasses that political stronghold. Lack of implementation-oriented direction of ways forward. There has been little attempt to consider from an operational perspective how plant ethics can actually be applied in societal activities. We think about that all the time. A few notable exceptions are the analysis of the tourism industry by Cohen and Fennell, in which the authors explore this commercial sector's connection with plants. Let's see, some others who consider this from a medical ethics perspective, and then others still who offer options for agriculture. Similar analysis are also needed for economic and social sectors. What about plant wellness? Not human wellness, but plant wellness? Maybe. So what can we learn from the animal advocacy movement? This is going to be interesting. Approaches utilized by the animal advocacy movement can also be useful for plant advocacy. Contesting speciesism. One important argument for animal rights and animal liberation relates to the notion that species is a socially constructed term that can be therefore justifiably contested as a legitimate basis for discrimination. Speciesism has important parallels with interhuman oppression through sexism, racism, ableism, ageism, and homophobia, in that species identity can be considered as yet another inappropriately pretext for discrimination. Contesting speciesism can be a useful approach for the plant advocacy movement to utilize in making its argument. I actually like this a lot. I have to say, we've had conversations before. We don't tend to talk much about like identifying species and things of that nature here in the naturally conscious community as much, because of exactly this. Like, every plant is a plant, every plant is a being, every plant has their importance, and I prefer the plant to tell me what I want to be identified as in some ways. I want the plant to share with me the important characteristics, and I do not want to see two plants that, because they're the same species, I feel like that must mean that they're exactly the same plant, because they're not. And this is the conversation that we had when I was talking about how, when this plant here, which unfortunately I've been gone for a while, so I haven't been able to have this proper conversation, was once a part of another plant that's over there. And as a collective, they were no-name Dracaena. And now that there's two, what does that look like? And which one, if either of them, is now named Dracaena? Like, this is a different, it's complex, but it's different. And I think that we do need to open ourselves up to a different kind of way of looking at them. Hence, we could discriminate without even thinking about it, because we're trying to do it based on species, like trees are more important than other plants, which I've literally heard that from people. Heard them tell me that trees are the most important. That's not plant advocacy, just so you know. Using multiple approaches. The animal advocacy movement has achieved incremental change on behalf of animals by using multiple approaches, including animal welfare and animal liberation. For example, animal welfare seeks to change laws, policies, and procedures so that animals that are used by humans for food, experimentation, and entertainment will receive better treatment. It has resulted in improved conditions for animals in some cases, although it does not challenge the human prerogative of using animals in ways harmful to animals. Alternatively, animal liberation or rights approaches do not presume continued use of animals for human purposes. They have worked successfully to help eliminate entire classes of oppressive behavior toward animals, such as for experimentation of their use for certain types of food. Employing a range of gradualist as well as more radical approaches can be useful for plant advocacy as well. And I think this is a good comparison, because while I still think that the output, the desired result in the end is going to be different, and we have to reconceptualize everything when it comes to plants, but I do think that the approach of having multiple types of approach, which is why, again, going back to my original discussion at the very beginning of this stream, is that I do think that NCC plays an extremely important role that is not mentioned here, which is the individual contribution, excuse me. Accent in the wrong place. The individual contribution and how our individual behaviors then affect greater societal behaviors as we multiply and express that. If we are confident in our actions and we don't have to necessarily proselytize, we can become examples. And as our movement, our naturally conscious movement grows, more and more examples head out and we start to change the hearts and mind. So it's like one of the many different approaches. I'm not saying it's the only approach. I'm just saying it's the approach that we have chosen to do here. Importance of emotional connection. The animal advocacy movement has been successful in attracting large numbers of followers, partially through building on people's emotional connection to individual animals or entire species through the power of story and through fostering the development of empathy for animals. Although there can be many blind spots and inconsistencies in animal advocacy in which people care about certain types of animals but continue to treat others poorly, definitely happens, emotion can create an entry point for heightened connection and sensitivity to animals and their issues. Emotion can also assist with plant advocacy, particularly with charismatic plants such as large or ancient trees. Individuating animals, a strategy of many animal advocates, also contributes to building emotional connections and ethical considerations of animals. This approach can be effective for certain plants as well. And this is where the music of the plants is such a powerful tool, because the music of the plants allows non-technical people, non-academic people to enter into a relationship with plants that is based on something outside of just I see a plant and I think the plant is beautiful, because when I think a plant is beautiful, I'm often want to manipulate that plant to keep that plant in that beautiful state, as opposed to the music of the plants opens you to a whole different form of connection and of realization of the sentience of the plants. And therefore, I think the music of the plants is one of those tools that it's probably still not kind of like academically accepted, although now that they're moving towards multi-species and interspecies communication, I think this could be a good direction. But because the music of the plants, I think, does allow for a more instantaneous emotional connection with not only that plant, but with the idea that, oh, all plants could do this. And that gets beyond some types of blind spots. So I would actually think that the importance of emotion, if I was rewriting this, I would add the music of the plants in here. Need to avoid boundaries of ethical concern. While the animal rights movement appropriately challenges the line between humans and other animals in terms of the way animals are treated ethically, it unfortunately polices another boundary between animal and other beings, such as plants, or even types of animals who don't meet certain desired qualifications, such as sentience. So although animal advocacy offers much that can serve as a model for plant advocacy, plant advocates should avoid their animal counterparts' tendency to place boundaries around who are worthy of ethical concern, since this discounts and disappears those who are excluded. Agreed on this. This is an important aspect. We need to go for plant sentience as a whole, not individuals are more sentient than others. Plant advocates should work to increase respect for all forms of life, including animals, as well as fungi and microorganisms, since all beings strive for good life for themselves in their own ways. And see, this is the other slippery slope, that once we start getting into plants, because plants are already a species, are already a kin home so different from the human and animal worlds that we know of, we're going to slide right into fungi and microorganisms, especially fungi. So I think it is a valuable ally, and I'm sure he'll probably talk about this, but I think that there is a valuable ally in the fungi world and in fungi advocacy too. Again, even more complex than plant advocacy because of so many variations. But I do think that this is something that can be a very beautiful partnership when done, kind of similar to what we're reading about in Underland with Merlin Sheldrake, and what we read in Entangled Life, in Merlin Sheldrake's book himself, about, you know, some of these connections and the intertwining between plants and fungi and mycorrhizal and everything else. So definitely an area that I think that we should look at more. Important recent thoughts. So how can plant ethics be operationalized? Important recent thoughts considering the ethical aspect of the human-plant connection can be found in Plant Ethics Edition collection. This joins a range of other scholarship related to plant ethics in recent years, which that's the whole list of them. I will not attempt to summarize this growing literature here, but rather highlight some of the basic principles and approaches which seem especially promising as foundations for a practical ethical relationship with plants. A compelling ethical framework can be an important contributor to supporting the plant advocacy movement to improve the way plants are treated. I agree with this, but I think it's extremely important that this ethical framework doesn't come from a theoretical approach, but gets built from the bottom up, like in a biomimetic approach. We need to build from the bottom up, from the relationships that humans already have with plants, and then expand with an ever-expanding circles from there. Because I think if we start too conceptualized up at top, we run the risk of alienating certain people. So as much as I would like it to be a boom thing, I don't think it's going to be a boom thing. I think we're going to have to go through stages of this. Basic and easy to understand ethical principles, as well as clear set of guidelines for interacting with plants, can help to build a workable foundation for those wishing to relate to plants ethically. Relate to plants or relate with plants? I think there should be more with in all of this, by the way. With. That's why it's called, you know, reconnect with plant wisdom and reconnect with the plant world. It's with plants. With each used in appropriate context. In addition to these intellectually based approaches, the motivating and energizing roles of story and emotion are also critically important for fueling this movement. Absolutely. Hence why we have a writing club, like why we have our writing group, and why we also have our book club. We need to get more stories that really connect to people, and we need to take the stories and move the existing stories to the next level, because I feel like storytelling is going to be so important, and we just need to just make sure that we don't again go down the animal rights path where the idea of some species more important than others. So we need to make sure that our stories cover a broad range to be able to help us understand true plant sentience as plant sentience, and not as like true sentience only. Simple to understand principles. Using principles that are simple to understand and communicate, such as those outlined below, can help the plant advocacy movement to advance its work. Simple rules. This is a biomimetic approach. It's extremely important. It's one of life's principles. Simple rules. All of nature operates on very simple rules. They do not have a complex manual. Simple rules. Biocentrism and equivalence of all life. One can argue for respected treatment of plants using a biocentric ethics that holds that each living being has intrinsic value. It's a good starting point. And recognizes equally of species in moral consideration. This approach builds upon the acceptance of the essentialist point that plants, like all other living organisms, have an intrinsic goal of flourishing, and that they deserve to be treated with dignity, care, and respect. This is consistent with an understanding of biological life in which all organisms seek to fulfill life for themselves. Yes. 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 I feel like you could also cite Capra in a lot of this. The golden rule. An alternative approach is to base ethical treatment of plants on a simple to understand principle such as the golden rule, as is proposed by Beckhoff, for relating to all living beings. The golden rule is an intuitive and universal principle that exists in almost every cultural tradition, with its essence being that one should not act towards others as one would wish to be treated. One should act toward others as one would wish to be treated. One could use one's moral imagination to consider how a plant would want to be related to. I'm thinking. See, my problem with this is that that's just more anthropomorphism. And I don't think that that's correct. So I don't think that this is the right approach. Because my opinion only, I welcome all your opinions. But I feel like this approach would lead to some blanket responses that are based on human physiology and human way of being in contact with the world, and not the same as the way plants are. This is the reason why in Reconnect with the Plant Kingdom, which is, you know, inside of Blooming Sprouts, why I added that whole module on life and death. I feel like we need to enter into, I think before we can go down something of creating a golden rule like this, to really create a simple golden rule, we need to connect deeper to the mind of plants, probably also to the mind of animals, to fungi, to everything, but we need to connect more into ourselves as nature and not just as human in order to arrive at something that can be defined in this way. Because if not, we risk creating a golden rule that we think should apply really to humans more than anything. And I don't even think it probably should apply to humans in the same exact way. I think it has to be much more relative. I don't know. This is another one of those areas that we need to have some more conversation on. Another great topic for us to take and have conversation on. Let's see. It is intuitive that plants would prefer not to be harmed or injured. Is it? Deprived of adequate water or nutrients or exposed to damaging pests. The golden rule could then be applied accordingly. Is it? The reason I'm saying this, let me take an example of the damaging pests, okay? We know that in a healthy ecosystem, plants can resist is not the right word, can tolerate a certain amount of damaging pests. And that those damaging pests might seem like they're damaging, but they're also benefiting in other things. Every kind of species has the species, when it comes to pests, to the insect world, every single one of them, well, not every single one of them, I'm not an insect expert, excuse me for the large generalizations. Let's go for something a little bit narrower. There are so many pests that in reality are pollinators. And so if we use this rule and we do not expose a plant to what we think of as a damaging pest, do we risk actually changing the entire way that the relationship plants have with these insects, and so that the pollination doesn't occur? So I think that I still think that there's an entire sort of caveat to what we're reading that says we need to step deeper into the plant mind in order to have a really important and what's the word I'm looking? Not efficient, but like useful plant advocacy movement. We need to step deeper into the concept of plants as the beings that they are and not as human beings. So, right, exactly like Jill says, or when Michelle says here, butterfly life cycle, or as Jill says, ask nature, what is its dream? To be well-being with all of us. And this is why that communication piece is important. And the deeper we step into the concept of the plant mind becomes extremely important. Because if not, we run the risk of creating an anthropomorphic sort of model that feels all warm and fuzzy. And I'm not saying that this might not be step one. Could very well be that it is a very good step one, but we could just get stuck on step one. So yeah, exactly what Carol just said, typical disconnected approach, disrupting the ecosystem, right? This concept that we might think we're advocating for plants, but we're using human rules, and those human rules then therefore disrupt the actual natural cycles. Until humans retake their place in the natural world as beings of nature, recognizing their own sense of being nature, and therefore are able to slip more consciously into their vegetality, into their animal instincts, into their rock sentience. Sentience is maybe not the right word based on our last conversation in the book club. Their rock sensitivities, let's put it that way for now. Let's just be safe right now for a second, until we can more consciously slip through these different states to our fungal sporing, type of thing, then I think we cannot, it is dangerous to try to imply a golden rule. I think it might be more disruptive than we think. So thank you all for giving me additional words. Everybody that's, in the chat, thank you. That helps so much. Okay, the precautionary principle. Beckhoff also advocates for using the precautionary principle in operationalizing ethics. This approach does not demand certainty, but asks us to act in light of unknown that could have a negative consequence for other beings, to prevent these negative outcomes, even if we don't know for sure that they will occur. For example, the precautionary principle could be used to justify treating plants as if they feel pain and discomfort, even if it has not been or cannot be proven that this is the case. I thought we do know that they feel. We don't know if it's considered pain or not, but it's feel. And this has some merit. Again, we have to be very careful to not go too far down the anthropocentric part. And this is why plant communicators are so important. Plant communicators become a conduit to help people, to help other realms better understand what it is what it is that a plant really wants, until we get to the place where, again, I feel like we can get to a place where we are so in touch with our true nature that we can then more easily understand the needs of others. But I just think we're not there yet. We're not there. Approaches based on relationality, reverence, and respect. Other well-known basic ethical approaches can be applied in relating to plants. Albert Schweitzer's concept of reverence for life, St. Francis of Assisi's deep affection for all living things, including flowers and trees. I like how you have to caveat all living things, all living beings, including flowers and trees, because flowers and trees are. And Aldo Leopold's land ethic. Each recognize the connection and commonality between humans and all other living beings, and the need to treat other beings with respect. Considering plants in a relational way flattens the generally vertical and hierarchical way in which plants are typically viewed, and replaces it with a more horizontal and relationship-based approach. To the view of other beings is also typically associated with indigenous peoples who consider plants to be relatives. And this is beautiful. I like this one. Warburg, Fetters, and Kaufman suggest an approach based on indigenous ethnobotanist and scholar. We already talked about it. We're going to call him Kiwe. Peschel's principles for gathering natural plant materials, which are based in respect. As further distilled by Wita Lee Boisvert, one of Kiwe's students, it all comes down to the desires of all beings for love. And this love, where was I? Hold on, let me think. I read so much. I'm going to get back to this conversation of love, because I think I did talk about it on my podcast when I talked about my last research, Method Action research group here in Delmenhur, where we kind of, in our approach of connecting with the plant world, ended up in the concept of love inadvertently without realizing it. And just the other day, I was reading another paper, which I can't remember right now, but I will remember it, that took me to the concept of love again. And this is really fascinating, because I'm not a kumbaya love person, and I am seeing it coming at it from my more natural self. And wow, it's so powerful. But I don't want to get into it right now because I don't want to, it needs to percolate more, but it's coming. It's coming. It's coming. Relating to plants as respected fellow beings does allow for using plants for human purposes, but insist on treating plants decently and not overusing or abusing them. And I think that, again, it's not just allowing using plants for human purposes. I think even that term is mistaken. We need to think about the reciprocity, like Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about, and how what we're talking about is about working with plants. And in some ways, when we work with plants, they give of themselves, they give of their body. I use the word sacrifice, and those of you that have been with me for a while know that for me, sacrifice is a beautiful thing. It's a positive word. It has very positive intentions to me. It is the beauty of sacrifice, not the negativity of sacrifice. So just make sure that we're not taking this as like something bad, but more of like, I do the right thing because it's the right thing to do and I feel good about it. So it's really an important aspect that I go. Okay, so I just want to see how many pages. We're on page 11 and I want to see where this finishes because we might have to make this. Oh, no, we're at the end. We're at the end. And it's 7:07, so we're gonna 7:07 my time, 7 minutes after the top of the hour, wherever you are. Jill says the most important is love aspect among all beings as to what comes up in the Underland discussion. Exactly, in the Plant Wisdom Book Club, we're reading Underland right now, and I agree. We are starting to really get to this point in almost all of our readings that there is this combining energy that is called love. And again, I'm not going to get into it too much now, but know that's on my thoughts of how we're going to weave this better, and not again in the, all red hearts and, kumbaya thing, but really in that energetic, Tiferet from the Kabbalistic perspective, like Christ-centered, not religiously associated love piece that I feel like we need to dive into, because that's one of the conduits that we can use for our plant conversations, for our communication with plants, and our collaborations more than anything, and co-creations. Using rational guidelines and frameworks to advance plant ethics. In addition to applying plant ethical principles such as those above, several sets of guidelines have been developed for operationalizing on ethical relationships with plants. Koechlin, I think, discusses the concept of dignity of plants and presents the something thesis. Rainauer, I'm going to go with that. Thesis on the rights of plants. These are 29 specific thesis endings and rights of plants, which include reproductive rights, rights to independence, rights to evolution, right to survive. Rights to evolution and reproductive rights, believe it or not, is going to transform landscapes. And this is why I think this advocacy piece has to have an educational piece around the fears and the changes, because many plants, non-natives, and plants that are placed and that are deliberately planted in the wrong environment do not reproduce. And if plants should have reproductive rights, therefore we will need to rethink everything that we think about relating to landscaping, because lots of landscaping does not account for an ecosystem being healthy enough to evolve on its own, because that would change the design that you put in, or reproduce on its own. I'm just throwing these things out there because I think that that's one section so far that we're missing, which is the highly important educational pieces that need to relate to an advocacy in order to move people slowly from what they're doing today with no judgment and with just loving accompaniment to the place where we want to be, knowing that what you've been doing has been wrong, but it's okay because you did it based with the information that you had. And now we're going to move forward. Right to evolution, right to survival as a species, right to respectful research and development, and the right not to be patented. Dig against Monsanto. Summarizes some of the arguments in favor of plant rights, noting that a collaboration of Venezuelan groups have proposed a Universal Declaration of Plant Rights with 22 points in 2004. That's another interesting thing. If you've never read it, it's worth reading. I have to find it. Maybe we'll go through it here. Yes, the ethical gardener, Michelle. Yes, exactly that. Exactly. Some frameworks for relating ethically specifically to crop plants have been developed based upon concepts of integrity and flourishing. Categorize 4 types of plant integrity: the right to accomplish its natural aim and to be treated as an autonomous being expressing self-regulation, the right to potentially complete its life cycle and to reproduce in a plant-worthy way, to the right to co-evolve with respect for its natural reproductive barriers and its species-specific genetic variation, and the right to be treated, nurtured in a way that is consistent with the plant's nature. I think I want these rights for myself. Yep. Hirno describes 4 dimensions of plant flourishing: plant vitality, completion of its life cycle, typical characteristics of the species, and fulfilling their ecological roles. I think I'm going to adopt this as for flourishing sprouts. All of you that are in flourishing sprouts, we might need to adopt this as the 4 dimensions of our flourishing. What do you think? Right? Vitality, completion of your life cycle, your life purpose, typical characteristics of your species, of what, who you are, and fulfilling of your ecological role, your role as part of a community. What do you think? I think this could work. I think there's a lot of stuff in here we need to look into. These guidelines can be applied more broadly to other plants as well. Importance of story and emotion in fueling this movement. Part of the success of the animal advocacy movement has been due to its ability to tap into its participants' emotions, as has been discussed above. A plant advocacy movement will also need to deepen and draw upon people's emotional connection with plants. Individuating plants can help to build these connections, as can opening the door to intuitive communication with plants. Yay! Which allows for plants to express their own perspective as perceived by human partner intuition. Plant advocacy based only on the science or philosophical ethics will not be as likely to achieve the reach and popular appeal needed for an effective movement, as would one that also incorporates a sense of genuine and heartfelt relationality. Agreed. And I think we need to be even more broad with this to allow so much of how do we connect and educate. I still think that there's an education piece here that's missing. Even though humans must harm plants in order to survive, as moral beings, we nevertheless are called upon to live with our plant relatives ethically. The human relationship with plants does not need to be an adversarial or oppressive one, even though it is necessarily will incorporate instrumental elements. Our goal should be to deepen our connection with plants in a way that allows us to use them when needed. And again, I think here we're going to talk about verbs and new verbs. We need a new verb that is the collaborative use of plants with permission and respect and desire of the plants. I don't know. Think about a word that might be that. Jill talks about the right to not be blocked for expansion of superpowers in all of nature. It's a good right. That's a good right too. It's a good right. Our goal should be to deepen our connection with plants in a way that allows us to use them when needed, but with ethical guardrails in place to avoid unwarranted destruction or degradation of plant lives. Natasha offers inspiration in how to grow a livable world. 10 not so easy steps as to how humans must learn to partner with plants in a joint struggle against the toxic changes of the Anthropocene. Oh, I'm going to look that up. I don't know that one. There is a clear need for organizational infrastructure for the plant advocacy movement, a role which the nonprofit The Plant Initiative is seeking to help support through its grant-making, education, and partnership building efforts. However, it will only be through broad collaboration well beyond the capacity of any one organization that such a movement will be able to take shape. I believe that the plants themselves will help us if we engage with them respectfully and in partnership to move in a direction that will lead to improvements in plant lives as well as our own. And I do like that he says that, because I do agree with that. I think that we need to bring the plants into the conversation, which is the other thing that's missing from here. I mean, we did talk about plant communication, intuitive plant communication in a piece, but I think it needs to be sprinkled throughout this entire document, which is what happens when the plants are at the table and part of the conversation. And we need to explore this even more. And it is co-creation. Yes, Carol, it is co-creation. We have to move to a model of co-creation, and therefore our verb is co-creation, or, you know, co-use sounds really bad, but I do think that there has to be this reciprocity which is a verb in and of itself that needs to kind of be expanded on. And we need to define some new terms that allow us to think about plants as partners and as co-creators, and the actions that they take in that co-creation, so that we get rid of words like use or take advantage of or things like that. While the plant advocacy movement has not yet arisen, there is now a growing readiness among many of its dominant culture to increase collaboration in directions that can benefit plants. The time is ripe for moving forward. Bravo, Paul Moss. This is the co-founder of the Plant Initiative and his executive director. So wow, there's a lot here. I think it's still worth it. I mean, we went through it kind of quickly, but because there's just so much. You can't fault how widely and well read he is. Yes, Carol, I agree. I mean, this is actually a great report. I think this is a really great start. This is something that can, I think, is actually in the right direction. There is nothing that I am faulting Paul Moss with, other than, I think that he is going and he's doing steps. I think we need to think of this as steps. I think we also have a different slant, like I said at the very beginning, as sprouts. And I think that this is great to hear that there is already thoughts in these movements, and we can add our sprinkling of pieces based on our experiences that it is. I know he didn't mention me, but he has mentioned me in other things. I think because I'm not a movement and he's not in NCC, so he doesn't see everything we do. I do know Paul, like in the sense that I've met him in person once before, many years ago, when I was in a biophilic conference, and I have interacted with him back and forth because every once in a while he does a shout out of the things that I do on the Plant Initiative. So he's not like, we're not immune to one another, but I think that I am not yet a movement, although I do see us in NCC as a movement, but that's not me. That's all of us. That's all of us together. And I think we're just going to keep pushing the boundaries. We're going to keep doing what we're doing, and we're going to keep expanding on that. So I want to thank you all, those of you that were here live for this. I want to hear your thoughts. I'm not sure exactly when I'll post it, but it'll be up by tomorrow in NCC, so that you can leave your comments and your thoughts. I'd love to hear more about what you're thinking relating to this movement. And also, please feel free to share, post, comment. What is it that you want to see us move towards in 2024 in NCC? Like, what is it where can we be better plant advocates and better plant stewards? Where can we speak better for plants, and where can we collaborate more deeply with plants? So I think that this is the aim here, like Jill just wrote, coherency and cooperation with all naturally conscious, agreed. And that's where we want to go. And so therefore, I want to hear all of your thoughts and ideas. And I'm looking forward to moving into the new year with even more bubbling up of conversations of this type, so that we can continue to be the best plant advocates, and more than anything, plant collaborators and allies that we could possibly be. So with that, resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance, and we will see each other again next Friday for our next paper. Bye-bye for now.